Today's story is titled, Our Father Signed a Contract That Ruined Our Lives, by SteveMcNellyFiction. The link to the story is in the description below. Please enjoy. My father loved a good paper trail. He always stressed the necessity of having proper documentation for every purchase, every agreement, every discussion that ended with something fundamentally different than when it had begun. He believed in the importance of paperwork and the uselessness of a good handshake. The only legal binding thing a hand can do is put ink to paper, he'd always say. And to believe the gesture of touching palm to palm holds any sort of weight is to open yourself up to the evils of human dishonesty. It is for this reason that, upon his recent death, my sister and I were left with the long, arduous task of sorting through the library of paperwork that the man left behind. When I call the collection a library, I do so without an ounce of hyperbole. His vast hoard of papers easily filled an entire large room's worth of drawers, files, and shelves. We knew we'd have to handle his last will and testament when he passed, and knowing our old man, we figured it would be a headache to get through. But at the time, we thought this one document would be the worst of it. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. Upon diving into his extensive collection of records, we were both genuinely surprised by how many old documents the man had hung onto over the years, even long after their usefulness had dried up. Bank membership forms from the 1970s for banks long since defunct. Half-century-old grocery store receipts, handwritten in blotchy, messy ink. Parking tickets paid lifetimes ago for cards he hadn't owned in decades. It was all there, filed away neatly in the darkness of his old office, waiting for the day that we'd have the displeasure of drawing it all back out into the light. Knowing that most of it was worthless, we were tempted to simply shred it all and throw it away, but the persistent nagging that something of importance might be hidden in that massive trove of paperwork was strong enough that it convinced us to sort through it all manually. In a way, this was actually a much more enriching experience than I would have thought. We got to see how our father's signature evolved throughout his life, and going through those decades worth of documents gave us a sense that we were reliving the life from start to finish. But at the same time, it was an agonizing chore that I dreaded doing each day. Because yes, it took us days to sort through all of the old paperwork, most of which was a complete waste of time. I suppose I couldn't really be upset about having to complete this final task for our old man. He provided us with a good life growing up, and the minor burden of sorting out his paper affairs after his death was a small price to pay compared to the work he had put in to ensure that we never wanted for anything and had always lived in the lap of comfort and luxury. I also can't blame him for his overly cautious desire to keep a paper trail of his entire life. He came of an age in an industrial town during a time when industry was on its way out. Jobs spawned through handshakes and goodwill suddenly vanished when the mines dried up and the mill's furnaces went cold forever. Nobody got any sort of severance package back then. One day you had a job, the next you didn't. One day you were able to put food on the table, the next you weren't. It was a harsh, unforgiving time in our region's history, one that we haven't yet fully recovered from even more than half a century later, and it set the stage for what my father's life would eventually become. Times were tough for our father and mother after he lost his job at the old mill. They managed to keep afloat for a while thanks to our mom's waitressing, as well as the various odd jobs that our dad worked, but it soon became clear to everyone in town, back then, that their livelihoods were dependent on an industry that had gone to an early grave, and without the industry, their economy wasn't going to last. Our parents needed a backup plan if they were going to have any hopes of getting by. Thankfully, our old man had one. Our dad loved to paint from a very young age. In fact, the second largest collection that he left behind, after his collection of paperwork, was his vast accumulation of personal paintings that he kept in his private gallery, for his own purposes, he used to say. Before the decline, painting had only ever been a hobby for him, a way to decompress and pass the time between grueling shifts at the mill. He never thought he could have made a living off his work until the desperate times came, and he found himself backed into a corner with no other means of making ends meet. And so, with his prospects running as dry as the mines and his optimism going as cold as the mills, he turned to that old passion in hopes that it would offer him a means of escaping from the ever-deepening hole that he found himself trapped in. Setting to work like a man possessed, he drew inspiration from his paintings from the urban decay and gothic, almost sinister landscapes of the region in which he had grown up. His work brought him little success in the backwater town that he called home, where people could barely put food on the table, let alone afford to blow their hard-earned wages on frivolous pieces of art depicting scenes that they could look at for free with a simple glance out of their windows. Knowing that he had no hope of making a living from his art in his current environment, and with the area's decline only growing worse by the day, my mom and dad decided to take on the ultimate gamble. They packed up their things worth keeping, sold the rest, and departed from the only place that either of them have ever called home. Their time spent away was, until the unfolding of recent events, largely a mystery to me. I knew they spent some time on the West Coast, where my father continued to work on his stalled art career, but any details of his successes or failures there were never shared with my sister or me by our parents. All either of us knew is that by the time they returned home more than a decade later, their fortune had been secured. I wish I had known the circumstances that had led to that fortune sooner. I wish I had asked them questions while they were both still alive to answer. While I doubt they would have told me the whole truth, I might have been able to glean something about what had happened while they were away. The work of going through my dad's old records started as a tedious slog, and only got worse as the task went on. We brought a shredder into his office and began meticulously going through each document, ensuring that it was irrelevant before condemning it to its fate. Leafing through those old files and deciphering the messy, aging words scrawled therein would have been annoying, bothersome work for people half our age, and with us now in our 50s, with our worsening eyes and less nimble hands, the task was an even greater test of patience. We did our best to stay positive during this time, to talk about our memories of Dad, and, to a much lesser extent, of Mom, and to keep the atmosphere as light and easy as we could. But this became more difficult as time went on, and we became disheartened by just how little progress we made against the seemingly insurmountable horde of records that was needed to sort through. The first noteworthy record, and thus the first one worth keeping, was found by my sister towards the end of the second day. I had just gotten back from taking a box of 3 decades worth of fast food recipes to the garbage trash can. I hadn't bothered to shred them, when I heard her speak from across the room. "Oh, wow." I placed the now empty box on the nearby shelf and turned to look at her.
"What's up? Find something interesting?"
"I'd say so," my sister said. "Come take a look." I approached her. As I drew near, I saw that she was at the beginning of a fresh box of records, possibly even the very first item inside. When I came up alongside her, she looked at me with an excited smile that she hadn't even considered wearing since the start of our task the previous day. She handed me the slip of paper in her hand without speaking, and I looked down at what was written upon it. It was a bill of sale for one of my father's paintings, one titled Gothic Decay. The bill was dated May of 1958, about 3 months after he and my mother had moved out west. "His first sale," my sister said. "I should have known that he kept a receipt for it." I read the bill over again and frowned slightly.
"Not the most lucrative sale in the world, was it?"
"Well, no," she said. "But it was a start." She looked back into the box that she pulled the bill from. "It looks like these are all sales receipts for his paintings from back then. Maybe even every single one that he sold."
"Knowing Dad, he probably is every single one of them," I said.
My sister pulled the next one from the list. It was dated September of 1958, roughly 4 months later, and indicated that the painting had sold for a similarly pitiful price. The third sold in December, again, for what I'm sure was barely enough to cover the cost of his art supplies.
"Not a lot of money coming in that first year, huh?"
I said. This pattern continued for 2 more instances before ending in April of the next year. In almost a year's time, our dad had only managed to sell 5 paintings, and each were far lower than he probably would have liked. I might have felt bad for him, had I not known of the wealth he would eventually amass. By flipping through the receipts, we learned that he didn't sell another painting for most of that year until November of 1959. I imagine during that long gap, he'd been forced to jump back into doing odd jobs in order to make ends meet. That likely led to a perpetual cycle of grueling work, during which he probably had little time to paint, and even less time to market his work. It's a miracle his aspirations didn't die there, and if I didn't know any better, I would have assumed that they had. My sister looked at the receipt from November of '59 and whistled sharply. "Hot damn! Look at this one!" I did as she instructed, then joined in her surprise whistle.
Shit, that's quite a jump.
I guess this is when he finally made it, huh? To say he had made it with this sale was an understatement. This piece, titled Rusttown Blues, sold for more than double what all of his previous paintings had sold for combined, and things didn't stop there. In fact, they only seemed to speed up. He sold 2 more paintings that November, each for a higher price than the last. In December, he sold 8 more. In 1960, our old man was selling upwards of 10 paintings a month, and the number only grew from there. Over the course of the next decade, he sold dozens and dozens of paintings each year, each for staggering amounts of money. I didn't know how he ever had time to complete so many paintings, and I'd wonder if his seemingly obsessive commitment to his work is what sowed the seeds of what my mom eventually did. Exactly 10 years later, to the very day in November of 1969, he sold his last painting of the bunch. It would be the last one he ever sold in his life. "And that's all she wrote," my sister said.
This must be when he and Mom came back home, I said. A shame he didn't paint any more after that.
"Well, with a few years after they came home is when he and Mom had us," she said. "Must have been tough to keep up his work while raising a family."
Yeah, well, Mom didn't exactly make it easier for him, did she? I said.
My sister shook her head. "No, that she didn't." I paused for a contemplative moment before speaking again.
You ever feel like we took his dream from him?
My sister shook her head. "He had plenty of time to pursue that dream. He and Mom had us pretty late, especially for the time, and they knew that if they wanted to raise a family, they really needed to get on it. They made the choice to come back here and have us. We didn't force it on them." I shrugged, still itching with a sudden sense of guilt that I couldn't quite shake.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Just like how nobody forced Mom to change her mind.
"Yeah," she said. "That too." We let the conversation drop and returned to our work. The painting sales were the first items in the entire collection to be spared from the shredder. Deciding it was good karma to finish on that high note, we wrapped up our efforts for the day and both of us went home. I spent a long time that night thinking about those dozens and dozens of paintings that my father had sold back then, wishing that I could have seen even one of them. I had shrunk so far into my own head that my wife actually noticed my aloofness and asked if I was all right. I reassured her that I was, even if the answer didn't feel entirely honest. She eventually drifted off to bed, and I decided to decompress for another hour or so before following her there. I opened my laptop and looked up a few of the names of my dad's old paintings that I remembered from the receipts to see if any copies of them had ever been posted online. No dice for any of them. His works must have only really traveled in small, private circles, which had eventually kept them just as private for all these years. I suppose the money earned from them was tangible enough, but I found myself wishing that I had more to remember my old man by than just a bunch of rotting old documents collecting dust in his house. My sister and I started back up again the next morning. We spent most of the day locked back into the banality that we had grown accustomed to in the previous 2 days. My sister threw out a box of expired grocery store coupons. We once again didn't even bother shredding those. while I saw to the destruction of a drawer full of long-expired vehicle registrations from several different states. She shredded dozens upon dozens of old blank statements. I found and rescued our parents' marriage license, if only in remembrance of a happier time when the four of us all still lived together under the same roof. Besides, our father had never actually officially filed for a divorce. He'd never been able to find our mother in order to make such a thing official. So I figured keeping the marriage license around could almost trick us into believing that those good times never actually came to an end. Inconsequential acts of shredding and saving went on for some time, until I discovered a file stuffed with years upon years of census data, something I almost tossed without a second thought. Had I actually done so instead of taking a few minutes to leaf through those papers, I may have never discovered the knowledge that I am now forever burdened with. Upon deciphering the messy handwriting, I managed to find my parents' names in the 1958 census listed at some West Coast address that I had understandably never heard of before. A quick online search told me that it was a small one-bedroom apartment that, based on its pictures, looked like it hadn't been renovated since well before our parents had lived there. The 1959 data showed similar information. It wasn't until I reached the 1960 sheet that I raised my eyebrows in surprise.
The hell is this?
My sister, who was in the middle of eating a peanut butter sandwich, turned to look at me. "What is it?" I flipped back and forth between the three sheets, thoroughly confused.
This census data. It doesn't make sense.
My sister returned her sandwich to its plastic bag, placed the combo onto a nearby box of records, and walked towards me. "What do you mean? What could be so crazy about census data?"
Take a look,
I said, handing her the 3 pages.
These first 2 just show Mom and Dad living in an apartment together. Nothing strange there. But look at the sheet for 1960.
My sister did as instructed, then frowned as realization hit her. "Who is this third person listed here?"
I don't know, I said. It's kind of hard to read the handwriting on that thing, and parts of it aren't even filled out, but it looks like she has her last name. Did a relative of Dad's come to stay with them for a while or something?
"I guess that's possible," she said. Then, after a pause, "Their address is also different on this third one." I looked up the address on the 1960 paper and found that the house there, built in the early 1950s, was a huge upgrade to the apartment that my parents had been living in before. This made sense. By early 1960, our dad had started seeing good returns on his painting sales, and they likely could have afforded at least a mortgage on the house by the time the census was collected. But this didn't explain who that third person could have been. My sister took the census files and combed through more of the sheets. "This woman, whoever she is, stayed with Mom and Dad for several years, even moving to another house with them."
That's weird, I said. How have we not heard of her before?
"Maybe they had a falling out with her after this, and didn't like to talk about her."
I guess that's possible,
I said, once again not feeling confident in this explanation. "She looks to have moved out when they moved back here," my sister said. "She's on the 69 census, but not on the 70 sheet."
She must have stayed out west.
"Do you think she's still alive?" my sister asked.
I don't know, I admitted. If she is, I wouldn't even know how to get in touch.
"Makes me wish we still had phone books," she said. "I doubt we'd find a woman her age anywhere else." A quick online search proved my sister right. We were unable to find anything conclusive about the mystery woman who shared our last name. It was as if she didn't exist outside of that census data, and even then, the information we can glean about her from the paperwork was limited. Her age was left blank on every census form that she appeared on, so we couldn't even guess what her relation was to our dad. With the trail going cold, we dropped the conversation about our mystery relative and moved on with our task. My sister returned the container holding the census data to me, and I continued to comb through it. It contained data for every year of our dad's life, from the age of 18 until this past year, when he passed away. I watched as they returned back home from out west, after which their number went from 2 back up to 3 the year after I was born. From there, we expanded to 4 when my sister came into the picture. We remained as 4 for several good years after this. Then abruptly, the number reduced back to 3. Seeing the sudden reduction felt like a punch to the gut. It took the wind out of my sails and killed my desire to review the remaining years. Following a brief skim of the remaining data, I placed the container aside and, after a short period of consideration, decided not to shred them. I determined that, at the very least, the information present in that thick stack of paper was interesting enough to hold on to. Our day continued on as normal. We were making real progress, and by the end of the day, could see that the end of our cleanup was in sight. We thought about staying late that night and getting ourselves that much closer to the finish line, but seeing as we both had families to return home to, we decided to call it a night at a reasonable hour. I spent a long time thinking about the mystery woman that night. My wife, seeing that I was once again distracted, asked me what was wrong, and I told her about what we'd experienced that day. She reiterated the point that my sister and I had discussed about the woman likely being a relative that our parents had a falling out with, and suggested that I not worry about who she was too much. This proved difficult to do, but with some effort, I managed to set the woman aside long enough that I was able to get some sleep that night. We got started early on the 3rd day, eager to get through the rest of the paperwork with haste so that we could potentially finish the task by that afternoon. Most of the morning passed in a blur of shredded documents, many of which I couldn't identify now if I tried. Scraps of ruined paper filled the several surrounding garbage bags and tarnished the floor in bunches of long, thin streamers. We worked quickly and quietly, with little time spent on conversation. I was certain that we both spent the entire time thinking of the strange woman who shared our last name. Though we hadn't met this woman, nor had we ever seen her face or learned of her exact connection to our family, there was something about her that made me feel as if I'd known her my entire life. It was a strange sensation that I just couldn't shake, and it made me even more eager to learn more about her. Was she a woman that I had met in my youth and had forgotten about until that census data dragged up the memory of her from the murkiest trenches of my mind? At the time, I was certain I would never know. Anybody who could have told me the truth was already dead. What I didn't realize at the time was that I would be learning her true identity very, very soon. This knowledge would change everything I understood to be true about my family, and even as I write this, I wonder if I would have been better off never knowing it. It was still fairly early into our day when I discovered the file containing the copies of our birth certificates. We might have found it strange that our father had made those copies had we not known who we were dealing with, but it didn't surprise us at all to find them amongst his collection. What was surprising, however, was that where we had expected to find only 4 birth certificates, we actually found 5. Leafing through the stack, I passed first my sister's, followed by my own, then our mom's, and finally our dad's. I figured his would be the end of the file, and seeing as these were all unofficial copies and were not necessary to keep, I thought I would soon be sacrificing them to the shredder god that had been so gluttonous these last few days. But what I saw there behind my dad's certificate halted my every movement, and made me completely forget about the destructive deity that I had just been so ready to honor. I don't remember speaking, but I must have, because my sister asked me what was wrong. Knocked free of my sudden surprise, I looked up at her with a confused look on my face, struggling to even find my words, as I weakly held out the 5th birth certificate for her to take. My sister approached and took the paper from my lame grip, then grabbed onto it with both hands and looked over it. A frown that must have resembled my own from a few moments ago crept across her face. She briefly flipped it over and looked at the back, as if its rear would somehow reveal it to be some sort of post-mortem prank played on us by our old man. When she saw that it wasn't, she flipped it back over again and reviewed it another time. "What the hell is this?" I leaned over once again and examined the certificate. Much to my chagrin, its details remained the same as they had been from our initial viewing. Written there, in unmistakable black ink, was the now familiar name of the woman, of the girl, who had shared our last name.
"Is the person from the census,"
I said, voicing what we both already knew.
"The one who lived with Mom and Dad?"
"Yeah," my sister said. "Except her birth year is listed as 1959, the year before the 1960 census. That means instead of being one of Dad's cousins or aunts, she has to be his
daughter,"
I finished for her.
"Their daughter, and our sister."
This fresh revelation stifled us with a stunned silence that clung to us quite some time. My younger sister, so shocked by what she had read, needed to sit down in a nearby chair. I opted to lean against the sturdy desk behind me. "What's going on here?" my younger sibling finally asked. "What's happening?"
"I don't know,"
I told her. These 3 words were the only ones that I could muster. She shot me an almost accusatory look. "You didn't know about this?"
"Of course I didn't,"
I said.
"Mom and Dad never told me anything about them having another kid."
My sister considered this for a few moments, then seemingly accepted it. "What could have happened to her? And why would they keep that from us?" I shrugged.
"Your guess is as good as mine."
"Did she suddenly die out west or something?" my sister asked. "Is that why they came back here? To distance themselves from the pain of that experience?" I looked down at the file again.
"There isn't a death certificate here. Don't you think if our sister had died, that Dad would have included it in this file?"
"It could be stored somewhere else," she said. "Or maybe he just didn't want to remind himself of it. Maybe he just wanted to forget whatever happened to her."
"But then why would he keep her birth certificate in here?"
I realized that, unlike the others, this one was the genuine article instead of being a copy.
"And besides, knowing Dad, he would want the death certificate filed, regardless of how painful it was for him to do."
"Maybe she went missing," my younger sister suggested. "Maybe she was abducted or something, and they never declared deceased, just like they did with Mom."
"But Mom didn't go missing,"
I said.
"She left."
"Still, same idea. Maybe since they never declared her deceased, he never had a death certificate to file."
"Maybe."
I didn't remember seeing any other old articles about a missing child when looking up our older sister's name, but it's possible I either missed them or didn't recognize them as pertaining to the same person that I was researching.
"You think they would have at least told us about her, though?"
"I'm not going to pretend to know what went through their heads at any given time, especially not through hers." I didn't respond for several lengthy seconds.
"Yeah,"
I eventually said.
"Yeah, I guess you're right."
We didn't speak for a while after that. We didn't quite know what to say. The 2 of us returned to our work, but it was clear that neither one of us was particularly enthusiastic about the task ahead. And so after another half hour or so of cleaning up our father's documents, we decided to call it a day early and return the next day to hopefully finish up. I didn't tell my wife about what we had learned that day. I would eventually, but I needed time to process it for myself before I felt like I'd be able to vocalize our discovery to anyone else without being interrupted by a crippling panic attack or a deadly deluge of tears. I'm sure she realized that something was off about me again, but unlike the previous times, she didn't ask me about it. I think she could tell it was a demon better left undisturbed until the time came that I was ready to poke at it with a big, sharp stick. I lay in bed for hours that night, emotionally exhausted from what I had learned that day, but paradoxically unable to sleep. I thought about my older sister, who she had been, where she was now, if she was anywhere at all, why she had been kept a secret from my extant sister and me for more than half a century. Such a train of thought proved to be a strong sleep repellent, but eventually slumber's inevitable persuasion managed to convince my mind to slip into the realm of darkness. When I slept, I dreamt of her, even though I had never seen her face. I knew the person in front of me was my older sister. She started out as a baby, the age she was when she was in those census papers, and she began to age rapidly, passing through dozens of stages of her life in a matter of seconds. She eventually morphed into an adult woman that she may or may not have become. I asked her what had happened to her, why she had been lost to us for so long. She couldn't answer. All she could do was frown at me, and then start to cry. Spirits were low the next morning. My younger sister and I felt crippled by the seemingly unconquerable task that was sorting through the relatively few remaining documents in our father's collection. But with a pair of heavy hearts and a lack of enthusiasm, we set to work on completing the job before us. I don't remember when or where my sister found the contract. I suppose these details don't matter. What matters is that its discovery changed everything, and that it unleashed something into our lives that we would never be able to put back into the metaphorical tube. God, how I wish we could. It was buried beneath a pile of other contracts of significantly lesser importance. My little sister might have even looked past it and thrown it away had she not been careful, though I doubt she could have missed the bizarre, Stygian signature planted beneath our father's at the contract's end. She spent a while reading it over before she showed it to me. It wasn't very long, so she must have reviewed it at least a dozen times while I sorted through other things, oblivious to her prolonged silence that had been so normal that day. The document didn't read quite like any contract I'd ever seen before, and certainly not like any of the contracts that were in our father's collection. It was handwritten on a sheet of yellow, ancient-looking parchment, penned in a way that looked like it had been scrawled in haste, but at the same time, with an elegant penmanship that looked practiced, as if its writer had ample experience drafting such documents. I refused to copy down the words of the contract verbatim, but will do my best to paraphrase. The contract stated that for a period of 10 years, our father's paintings would bring him fame, wealth, and success. He would create important and beloved works of art with both haste and ease, which would effortlessly sell as soon as they went up for auction. At the expiration of those 10 years, the wealth he'd earned would remain, but his fame and status would be forever lost to the greater world, remembered only by himself and by anyone who believed him when he told of his forgotten past. Also on that day, exactly 10 years from signing of the contract, and on each subsequent 10th anniversary, the writer of the contract would return to collect something from our father of the writer's choosing, which our father could not refuse. This would continue until the death of either party involved in the contract. The document was signed twice, first by our father in that same handwriting that we had seen countless times and grown intimately familiar with in the last few days. His signature was followed by a nightmarish scratching of lines in shapes that I could not in good faith call a word, at least not one present in any known language. Just looking at this malicious shape made me profoundly uncomfortable, and conjured within my mind countless pillars of evil imaginable only to the most tormented of souls, and many that are mercifully beyond any existent soul to ever know. Both signatures, if this is what you want to consider the second blasphemy of writing, were penned in a splotchy reddish-brown solution that I could not identify, but which I doubted and still highly doubt was any sort of ink. Our father's name was written in neat print next to his signature so that it was easily legible. The other signer's name, however, was not awarded the same privilege. Beneath both signatures, though, was written a date, one that fell early November of 1959. My sister and I sat in incomprehensible silence for what felt like hours, passing the contract back and forth whenever one of us had mustered the courage to read it over again. The heavy, unspeakable weight of the document resting between us seemed to distort the very fabric of reality with its density. When we finally spoke of it, both of us acted as if we didn't understand what this contract could have meant, but I'm sure that we both knew right away what its implications were. Our father, still struggling to make a living even after he and our mother had moved out west, entered into an agreement with someone, or something, that promised him the success he so desperately dreamt of and craved. And so he acquired a decade of wealth, fame, and success in exchange for a lifetime tormented by whatever entity he had taken up this contract with. He would then go on to die in obscurity, the extent of his success remembered by nobody else except for the thing that continued to collect from him decade after decade, taking more and more from the man that it was so determined to torment and eventually destroy. Such were the terms that our father had entered into, and such were the terms to which the contract had bound him, until the time came that death finally set him free. I'm sure it's not a mystery what this entity collected from him after the first decade had passed. Subsequent decades, though, are a little more unclear, but I have a strong idea of at least 2 of those collections, which occurred while I still lived in our family home. One of these I'm sure you can deduce, the other I choose to keep to myself. Thinking back with a freshly opened mind to those early years of my life, I can recall a pair of times that I am now certain each occurred on a year ending in 9, that I was awoken by a suffocating sense of overwhelming primal darkness that swept over our family home in the blackest, coldest hours of the night. At the time, I assumed these occurrences to be the product of my own personal nightmares, quickly forgotten and seemingly unrelated to the tragedies that immediately followed them the next day. One of these occurrences came when I was just a boy, another when I was on the cusp of becoming a man. The former came at a time in my life where I did not fully understand the tragedy of loss. The latter was how I became truly acquainted with it. More visitations and subsequent collections must have occurred after I'd moved out on my own, but since I was not present for them, their energies must have not reached me. I'm sure if they try, though, I can conjure more family tragedies that occurred in the final years of decades past, but at the time of writing this, I am not interested in reliving old pains just so I can retextualize them with my present knowledge, nor do I wish to discuss such things with my living sister, much like how I get the sense she'd rather not broach such subjects with me. I write this only a handful of weeks after having found my father's contract. My sister and I didn't finish our project that day, and we still haven't been back to sort through the rest of the old man's records. I'm not sure when we will, if we ever do. We left that contract locked in the study drawer of a metal filing cabinet in our father's empty home until the day comes that we ever feel the need to reassess it. In the meantime, I spent these few weeks in a complicated state of mourning for those I've lost and those I've never truly known. My father seeming to fall into both categories quite nicely. I've also spent a lot of time wondering. I wonder about what lies ahead for my sister and me at the end of this decade, now that our father is no longer alive to fulfill his end of the contract. When I last read the terms of the document, it explicitly stated that the contract expires with my father, but I would not be surprised to find those terms mysteriously amended, should I pull that cursed record from its metal coffin and review what was written upon it. I get the strong, nauseating sense that the words next of kin might appear somewhere in there now, indicating that our family is not yet free from the curse that my father, blinded by a desperation that I hesitate to call greed, forever shackled to us. At the time of writing this, my sister and I now have less than 4 years, a time so agonizingly long while also alarmingly brief, until we know if we are truly free from the contract that has been furtively looming over us our entire lives. I doubt if either of us will allow a single day to pass where we don't think of the document that we left locked away in our dad's home, where it will fester and rot until the day comes for its terms to flex their powers once more. I'm sure we will both think at length, as I already have, about what will come for us on that cold autumn day in November of 2029. About the dark, primordial presence that is no longer bound by its contract with our father, and which may very well now possess free rein to attack us directly with its deadly claws of overwhelming malice. But I suppose we'll just have to wait and see what comes.